year, about this time, it was actually March, at the end of March and 1st of April, Jane and I got involved in a kind of exploratory effort with some faculty on campus. And we found, we got the people on campus, I don't want to embarrass them too much, but here are faculty that the students and their student ratings would say are in the top 10% in two ways. We learned a lot in their class, and they were spiritually inspiring. I'd actually had some faculty, and several of them were chagrined that they ever said this, but we were having a secularization class. We were reading George Marchant on this old American university that the Jacobsons referred to, and as we were talking about it, some of them said, yeah, but how do you do this? They were watching the religion get kicked out of the academy, essentially, and as we were reading this book, and one of them said, should I say, I guess it's okay as long as I identify who it was, but he was in the law school, and he really cares about this stuff. That's why he was reading about it. But he said, why is it so hard for me? Because I got to cover stuff so they'll be ready to pass the bar, and I don't have enough time. And I said, so let's see, what you're telling me is you don't have time to bring the gospel into your learning. It'll get in the way of their learning. Is that what you're saying? I know he didn't want to say that, but yeah, that was what he was saying. They got to learn this stuff, and there really is an issue there. There's a trade-off about how much time are we teaching religion here, or are we teaching Russian literature? Or what are we doing? So it isn't. It's not a gimme. It's a real issue for us, and a number of them felt that way. And I said, isn't that interesting? Because I had some students that I just been interviewing saying, well, I really remember stuff when they bring in a gospel metaphor. It helped, or when we apply it. Somebody was in accounting was talking about how when you're looking at the income statement and how you audit that, how you look at what's going on there, what kind of ratios you look at, what sorts of things you do in terms of the questioning. The way he helped them understand that is, imagine you're a Relief Society president or an Elderstone president, and you're looking at home teaching or visiting teaching reports. You see that it's 80%. What's your next question? Oh, and they go through and they started unpacking that. And the students were saying, that's what I learned from the class. They learned both how to be a better home teacher, better Elders Quorum and Relief Society president, but also the kinds of questions. It became intuitive for them. Oh, okay. Now I know why I'm asking that mathematical question and how I would calculate it and what it means to me and what else I do with it. Well, kind of an interesting, when does it help and when doesn't is still the question. It's not like I'm not trying to prescribe. I'm just trying to say, that's an interesting question. So we invited folks to come and talk to us, and we got about 30 from across these are the top 10% in each college. So we wanted to know, across colleges, what does it feel like to you? What have you done? Did you stub your toe at first? Did you learn anything here? And it was just fascinating. There's a whole lot more that we could ever share with you. But what we pulled out of that were four kind of themes here. And if Adeline gets them up, we'll actually show them to you. How are you doing, Adeline? Are we okay?
Good.
How much longer should I do my tap dance now?
Just a minute, because it has to restart.
Okay. But here are places where we agreed. And some of them, I was in the scholarship session, so I didn't get to hear what you were about. But one of them was about caring for your students. To a person, people were saying, yeah, that comes first. My question was, what does that have to do with the gospel and scholarship? Well, and they talked about that. It was kind of an interesting conversation. We may save that one to last because it sounds like that was one that other session did a lot on. But I think they had some different insights than the ones I heard, at least, coming out of the summary of what I heard coming out. What did that look like? What did it feel like? Another one is, do I have authority to preach the gospel in my class? There were some interesting differences. Another one had to do, how explicit are you? Can I use gospel language? When should I? When shouldn't I? Etc. So we're going to try to get into those. Some of them, these folks and others differed about. I think Kevin says, I always pray in class. I think that's what you do. I thought we were supposed to. Aren't we supposed to pray? And Glenn Christensen sitting next to him, and he says, that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't feel like, I'm teaching marketing. Who wants to pray about that? And so it was really an interesting, so we didn't agree on, and these are people who are doing stuff that students really appreciate. And Marie's saying, well, we're doing something for accreditation and mission statement stuff, and we think it's compatible with the gospel. And Brent's life says, well, but do you critique that from a gospel point of view? Well, no, but the students do, the returned missionaries. Anyway, so it's an interesting, we had different points of view. Are we okay?
I need your password.
Oh, okay. I've got one.
Sorry, it's ready.
Could I just say a word?
Yeah.
In our last session, we talked about the importance of students knowing that you care about them. And all the national North American research shows that's number one for students. It's really not how much you know, but it's how much you care about them. But when I was at the University of Oklahoma, we decided to do a little follow-up research and ask students, how do you know if your teacher cares about you? And the number one thing was, she called me by name. And then when you think about the temple, if you want to make a gospel connection, names are really important, aren't they? So in the morning session, I think it was Brian said he always gets the picture class roles. We have a coming soon from CTL, another way to get names and flashcards. This could be way cool. And at one point, it may feel a little like gimmicky. I don't want to, waste a lot of time. But when it's the number one thing to students that demonstrates that you care about them, it's worth every minute you can invest. So if you're going to make your PowerPoint with things that swoop in and beep and do cool things, I'd say spend that time learning those names, because that's an number one pedagogical strategy. And I think it also helps us remember that these are our brothers and sisters. When they have names, they're closer as brothers and sisters than just a big wash of humanity sitting in that large classroom. Thank you.
Great comment. Am I still doing song and dance? What other okay, here we go. So, can I, now how do I manage this? How do I drive it? Oh, okay. All right. Do you want to go to caring? Actually, this group said names, and we actually sampled. Then we actually took from comments from these faculty their hypotheses, where they seem to agree, or their conflicting hypotheses about what seems to help students. And then we asked the students. This last March, we got a Bob Rich's social psychology class. It's an applied survey research class to adopt us as a client, and we sampled 1,600 sophomores and juniors at BYU and asked them some questions about the hypotheses of this group to see whether they agreed. And in terms of caring for students, name was one of the things, but they had some other things, and so did this group. And so I don't know how much in the last session, what did you talk about in terms of ways to show that you care? Any specific ways that came out? Doesn't sound like there were specific. Dave?
Visiting with them
outside of class, and Michelle talks about some of that, but other things? Mentoring? Yeah, Stephanie?
I just got one fellow here, but I really thought, because I knew it was interesting here, I'm assuming he's in the sciences, and he assigns them to home teach each other when they get to difficult content and check with their fellow students to see if how the understanding is coming, and then report back to them.
So it's letting the students help. Wonderful. What's that?
Some child mathematics.
Why don't I go ahead and, as long as we're into that conversation right now, we'll see what's different from what you heard, what adds. Maybe that's okay, huh? So
It's a left-handed mouse.
it's a left-handed mouse. How do I click it? Do I just do
You just do like
the round circle and click? That doesn't work yet.
For some reason, I was invited to a meeting with Dr. Hiring, and it was a faculty group, and I don't remember
I'm sorry.
how it came about or who invited me, but in the course of that, he said, why can't undergraduates publish in the very best journals? And that thought stuck with me, and I thought I would experiment on that because impression that we have no idea what these people can accomplish when we have the opportunity, and it's a scary thing to realize how much of that doesn't happen because there are many others that could do this, and I don't know how you can take them all on.
Say, let your students know that you care somehow. And I just heard that everything that Jini said.
Extra base.
I worked at the FTC when I was here as an undergrad. I had a leader who never learned my name, and it always bothered me that he never took the time. There were only about 20 of us that he was over. It always bothered me that it was always, "Hi, Hunter, how are you doing?" And I guess that just, I just thought, I'm just going to learn everybody's name. And on the first day of class, we started a discussion. Jim, what do you think? Or, or I could, several of them have mentioned to me, wow, even my name. Just little things like that. And then I also had the opportunity to meet with them personally during the semester for class projects that we do. And during that time, I get to know them, get to know what their future plans are, and things like that. And maybe ask them about that at another point. And I just feel like, they don't, that old adage, they don't really care how much you know unless they know how much you care.
Just this week, I've had 2 students ask if they can just come visit with me about personal issues in their lives, and I thought about why they would choose to come to me. And I don't know what all the answers are, but I hope it's because, I hope one, it's because at the beginning of my class, that when we say a prayer, we always have a scripture thought. I often try to do lunches or dinners with them where we can just visit, and when I say often, it's not like a lot, but I've done that throughout my career, where I can get to know them on a personal level. One of the things, I had a friend just say this to me the other day. She's the only person that knows I'm sitting here today, but I shared it with her. She said, what are you going to share? And she said, one of the things I've noticed about you, Michelle, is you give really concrete feedback on assignments. And the students have implied that they know that I care about them, and I thought, how do they know? If I take the time to give them concrete feedback and how to revise an assignment, I don't just give them a grade necessarily, so they just receive. They just did their classroom management plan. They got a lot of feedback from me so they could revise it. They know I'm invested in them learning those skills, and that I really will support that effort. I try to create a really engaging classroom. I don't stand up and talk much. I mean, I do. I have PowerPoints, but a lot of it are activities, scenarios they have to work through, having class discussions where they share a lot of ideas and where I listen to their ideas and they build off of each other. I think those things all impart.
Makes it more accessible, more open, and you also give them bad grades. At least you give them tough feedback, it sounds like sometimes.
And I think that's important because then you're establishing high expectations.
Comments about, I don't know what's different from what you were seeing before. I'm going to see if I can get anybody to pick up a microphone and talk. But can you hear a theme in this? This isn't just about being nice to show you care, but it's about these undergraduates could publish in the top journals. They're good enough to do a lot better, and Michelle holds them accountable and raises expectations. There's a kind of a showing concern. Jack, tell your story. Where's Jack? Did you step? Where did maybe? I don't know if he left. I saw him step in. Jack was talking about at lunch somebody who's now in the administration in the law school, was one of his law students. He said, back in the 1980s, when I was a young faculty member who was full of himself and knew that the students could all do better, but he said, I really cared about several students. I gave them a lot of feedback on their writing, but on one, he was came from a minority group, and his writing was really bad. And he wrote all over it. And he said at the end, named him, and he said, if you don't learn how to write better, your children will starve. 10 years later, this young man comes back after a pretty successful law career, and they're now wanting to hire him at BYU. And that's the thing. He says, the thing I learned most from law school was that you cared enough to tell me that I wasn't doing it right and lifted my sights. You told me that I could do better and that you would help me, but you put it right between the eyes. Your children will starve. And he cared about my children too, you know. So there was an interesting kind of point that was being made here that wasn't just let's know your name and be really nice. It was expect more and care about me and believe in me. I think Brent Adams, who was the one who was at first talking about publishing with his students, was saying, oh, I saw them, after Elder Eyring had said this, I saw them in a different light with people with that kind of potential. And it was divine potential. And so he extolled their virtues that he now saw newly. Anyway, so there's something about caring that's different than what I had thought about when I heard the research. What are you seeing in that? And what anybody else on the panel you want to say anything about this? Any one of you? Doesn't sound like it. How about you? Yes. I think you're going to have to get this one because I can't reach that one over.
There was something mentioned this morning about about giving assignments, professional assignments, and because I come from industry before I taught here, and I saw the opportunity for students to have assignments where they actually have to answer to someone other than the teacher. I think that's a kind of a caring thing. Like we had to answer to Dr. Lindsay for an assignment that we received from the administration for the wellness program. We did research in a research methods class this last winter, and so when you know that much more is on the line besides just an assignment and just the professor looking at it, when you know clients are coming, it adds a great deal of important pressure to a student, but it also says to them, we trust you can do this. And I think that was a comment that was made this morning, but it's something that I believe also.
Thank you. Hold on to it a minute. Well, anybody want to comment on that? My question is, what does that have to do with the gospel? With being Christian scholar teachers? Yeah, Kathy?
Well, I think just with, anybody can see through whether you really care about them or whether.
You want to stand up? Apparently there's...
Yeah, I think people can tell when you really care about them as people, or whether you're just employing some sort of gimmick to, boost your ratings or whatever. And I tie that back to the gospel through just the concept of we're all brothers and sisters. We all carry divine seeds of potential, and when we see that true divine potential in each other, we want to help them reach that. So. We're all supposed to be there sort of pulling each other along.
Great. Please, stand, yeah.
I guess I could share, actually it's probably President Hinckley's quote where he tells us that we're not just teachers, we're supposed to be shepherds over our students. So I thought, well, how do I do this when I don't have enough time to do everything that I'm supposed to be doing? And I teach a class where students have to get a C in it in order to advance in the major. And so it occurred to me one semester, I thought, well, how can I do better? And I decided I'm going to email every student who did on the first exam got lower than a C, than a grade that would allow them to pass the class. Email them personally, and even though I used common language in each email, I would send it to them as individuals and basically say, I know life's tough, but you've got to do better. What can I do to help you? I just want you to know that I want you to feel free to come in and talk. We've got to do better on this. I was shocked at how much the students valued that email. It was really surprising to me that, and then out it came. Often it came through an email. Some of them would come in and talk with me, but they wanted to express, and more often than not, it was, I haven't been doing well enough. I'm going to recommit myself to do better. And And maybe showing that you cared about the individual actually helps them want to learn more. It seems like was one of the responses.
That's great. Other comments? Let me just say one other thing. I was quite intrigued by Terry Warner's devotional. Has it been a year ago, something like that? But it was when we were talking about the Zion, education in Zion. Sorry, and he'd been doing. How many years had he been at this? 8 years. And one of his insights was, as he listened to the Carl G. Mazur story and read about it, did some more study, he listened to some colleagues of Carl, he was reading about colleagues of Carl G. Mazur's and some of his students talking about what a tough cookie he was. Talk about high expectations and a disciplinarian. This is a German scholar and rapping your knuckles if you didn't do it right. I mean, this was a very Germanic, I don't know if I'm over-stereotyping, way to teach, but and then he gets called up to talk with Brigham Young, and Brigham Young talks to him and sets him apart and tells him about the potential of these students and what they're supposed to do and how to teach them. And Carl G. Mazur's experience of this was a feeling, and then I think Brigham Young sets him apart. That's what I remember. Do you remember that part of the story? He was just filled with the Lord's Spirit and a different sense about who his students were. He left and now was extending himself. Talk about home teachers. He was having the students do all that they could do. And so when they got to class, the students would quiz each other on what they'd studied. And if somebody wasn't making it, they would have people who would serve as home teachers to help them. And the faculty, and then they would tell stories about Carl G. Mazur extending himself to help somebody who wasn't making it. I mean, all the themes we're talking about. Terry's conclusion was, when Brigham Young says to him, don't teach anything, including the alphabet or the multiplication tables, without the Spirit of God, he meant, if you will love your students, it's the love that will bring the Spirit in. It's that sense of who they are, and of lifting them to that level and extending yourself to help them, sacrificing for them, that will bring God's Spirit in. Well, that's quite remarkable. It isn't that I'm going to now teach them the alphabet, a different alphabet, which Brigham Young, by the way, was sponsoring at that time. He was trying to get away from, he had spelling problems. He was trying to do, the Deseret alphabet. And so maybe he meant something by that about revelation, about the specific content, but it wasn't so much that is Terry's conclusion as it was the charity that brought the Spirit. Well, it's kind of an interesting sense of caring. Yeah, please, Fred.
I think one of the most useful things I ever tried was, although it does take a little time, knowing names is certainly critical, but having each student write a one-page autobiographical sketch. And in the same idea, teaching by the Spirit. Teaching by the Spirit is teaching the needs of the student. Mm-hmm. And so by simply knowing that this student is whatever, they might have cancer, broken family, learning disorder, on some athletic team, I was amazed that in 5 minutes how an entire semester was changed. Because when I would be teaching something, I could bring it in with, and it wasn't just knowing your name, it was knowing specifically, I really know you, I don't just know your name. And I think it can really turn a classroom.
Jeff, I think that was something you were saying on tape here, that as you learned more about them, met with them, etc., then you felt inspired or to say things or that would help them understand that there was a connection there, that you knew, that you cared. It's a great idea, isn't it? Great practical. Yeah, please, Ron. Yeah, you can stand. We could be giving microphones to some of you. This will reach part of the way.
I spoke with a few of you before the session started and asked why you were here and what you'd like to get out of it. And if we're talking about caring, you've already done the most important thing. You're here. Mm. I'm not sure you can teach caring. But if you care, then you'll get revelation on how to express it. You've all been serviced by a used car salesman. They're interested in you, but do you feel that they care? That's because they're using gimmicks. And there are no gimmicks to caring, I don't think, because students can sense it in just a moment. But my compliments to you, you're here, and I think for that, you'll get revelation on how to express caring. I think that's how it works.
Amen. Paul?
I think most of the years I probably didn't teach fewer than 400, maybe 500 students a year. And one thing that I found helpful where it was difficult to know everyone's names is I developed the practice of always being the first in the class and the last out. And people would, that time they were free, I was free, and it was easy to have access to take sometimes the personal questions of why they'd have to be gone and things such as that. And it's just a great use of time. You know, it's a great place to get more opportunity for students to have contact with you.
You remind me of something that Ken Solon, who was also in one of our focus groups, talked about. He's in chemical engineering, and what he was able to do is he paid attention to, it's interesting, isn't it, that Rollin would come early and listen to what some of you wanted. I think that's an illustration of the very thing we're talking about, concerned about what you would want to know, and what Paul's doing by coming early to class and staying late. Ken would do something, even he'd be listening in the department and hear that it's midterms and boy, the students were really struggling and having a hard time. And he would come into class and as he would just watch, and if he saw hangdog expressions and sort of people nodding, he would stop just a minute and say, boy, you're looking really haggard. How are you doing? And then it would come out and he would listen to that a minute and he would hear that they were pretty troubled, don't know if I can make it, wow, this is hard. And he would say, I've been there. I know what it's like to struggle through really tough courses, and you wonder if you can make it. And then would say, you can. And you're here for a purpose. And here's who you are. Here's what, at least the general sense of what God expects of you from BYU. You've been blessed with this opportunity. I know it's hard, but the Lord will help you too. I mean, the very point you've just made, Ron. Quite a wonderful sense of paying attention to where they are, teaching them who they are, reinforcing them. Just an application of some of the things you're saying. Please.
Martin Hawking, music. These conversations today have awakened in me a contrarian spirit. Because we have spent all of our time lauding the personal touch. And I don't really want to speak against that. But I can remember when I was a scoutmaster in Texas taking boys on a 50-mile canoe trip. And that was a daunting task for 12 and 13-year-old boys. And the first night, I would have boys in my tent wanting to go home. But I watched them when they finished the 50-mile trek, walk with pride back among the lowly scouts that had stayed at the scout camp. And they had accomplished something that they didn't think they could accomplish. And so I don't think that we should lose sight of the fact that we teach with rigor and that we expect and empower them to do very difficult things they've never done before. Because if we fail to do that, they'll never grow up.
I think that's in the spirit of what we're saying, yeah.
Follow along with what he said. I know a faculty member who sent an email out to students he had worked with after attending a graduation here at BYU and talked about how impressed he was with the accomplishment of seeing these graduates that finally made it, and wrote to these students saying, you have no idea how powerful you are and how quickly you will be at this point and you will get there. And within days, a half a dozen students had written to this faculty member saying, your timing couldn't have been more perfect. I was actually about to drop out of school. And, you know, we should remember they've never been on this journey before. And they've never done it before. You need to be reminded that, yes, it is possible. And you can do it. And you'll do it by showing yourself you can do it. It's circular, but sometimes it's encouragement.
Thank you very much. Wonderful comments. I don't know about Arden's contrarian spirit, but because it felt like you were quite supporting, I think, this spirit of it isn't just a relationship. It's not just being nice. It is saying who you are and who you can be, and that can be a little tough. Jeff, do you want to say something?
I was just going to say,
by caring for them, you can push them harder. You know, if they know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, if they can succeed, then you can get more out of them. So I think it does combine exactly.
Yeah. Amen. Another comment? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I just have a quote that's going through my mind that our dean uses. He's been a mentor in my life, and he actually says, nobody rises to low expectations. And I really like that. I actually share that in my winter class because the premise of my class is about establishing high expectations for behavior in classrooms. But I like it in general. It guides a lot of how I teach. And I think by having high expectations, to draw it back to the gospel perspective, I think we're helping them to achieve the potential that Heavenly Father has established for them here on this earth, for the role that they're supposed to fulfill in their mission. So I think that there's a lot to be said about Heavenly Father has a lot of expectation of us, and we can be messengers and contribute to helping them to become who He would have them become.
Mary Headingren, English. I think one thing that sometimes is sort of daunting is saying, okay, I have all of these students, several hundred students, and they have all of these problems, and sometimes, we just don't have the same personality or something like that. And I think it's important to realize that we don't have to be everything for everybody. We can still show them that we care, even if we personally aren't going to be the ones to solve their problems. And so sometimes, having under-shepherds, having study groups where, I had a student in one of my classes who, dropped off the face of the earth, and I said, okay, who's in her study group? Who's going to call her? Who's going to email her? And she had to leave BYU for some personal reasons. And even after she left, she still had that study group that was calling her and that was able to help her and keep up with her. And they were her peers. And she got something out of them that she couldn't have gotten from me as her teacher. Similarly, being aware of the Career and Counseling Center, other professors that they may have, you can tell them, maybe you should find a mentor. I do, in English, I do a lot of interdisciplinary stuff and saying, okay, who's in your major that you can go to as a mentor? And we don't have to do everything for these students, but we have to show that we care for them and that we're willing to provide them with the resources they need.
That's just wonderful. My experience of my relationship with Heavenly Father helps me. I've had times when I've gone to Him and poured out my heart saying, I'm not good enough. I haven't done what I should have, and I felt chagrined. And I can remember a particular time I went to Him and I was pouring out my heart on it turned out a fairly minor thing, but I was feeling deeply discouraged. And the response that I got in that moment was so telling. The feeling that came was two thoughts, but there weren't two separate thoughts. It came at the same moment. It was, you're right. You can do better. I expect more of you. And you're mine, and I love you. And you can make it. Let's keep going. It was the sweet combination of, that's what what I'm resonating to is what I'm hearing from you is that it's not one or the other. And unless there's a sincere love and sense of expectation, and that those come together and that they're real. And I think the notion of, you don't just make this happen. I think this is something that the Lord changes our hearts about, and we can pray for that. Let's move to a couple of other topics. I just love the spirit that I'm feeling, at least as we're having this conversation. It's practicality as well as its spirituality. But let me do this one about faculty authority here, if I can. Did Adeline leave? Okay, maybe you'll have to do it there, Adeline. I can't drive it very well.
So one of the things I struggled with for years was a feeling of, look, I'm here to teach derivatives. That's what they signed up for. That's what they paid for. And I'm not their Sunday school teacher. I'm not their Elders Quorum president. I've got a friend who has said even the worst gospel doctrine teacher in the church has more authority to preach the gospel than I do. And that's kind of how I've felt about it. And it's taken a lot of years to find ways for me to even mention gospel topics in the classroom without feeling presumptuous or out of place.
I think Craig's been converted a little bit. I still am uncomfortable about it. It's just doing Sunday school. I've been Sunday. I was conducting sacrament reading more my testimonials from my own experience. But I tried that today in class, and the Spirit just, I feel like, oops, be careful. Don't presume to have the calling that you have.
I think it's also a challenge for us as faculty members. We have to be careful that what we say really is truth as best as we understand it, because we do have a problem throughout the church and throughout science of often saying more than what really has been established or revealed in both realms. In science, we extend it beyond what scientific evidence really indicates. In religion, we know that so-and-so said it, and if you really look, there's really been no revealed doctrine on it, but we know that such and such.
What kind of authority do we have to preach the gospel? I think that's the way Steve Thorley was raising it, and I think to some extent Craig Merrill. What is our authority? And Scott sort of ending up with the sense of what sort of authority do we have to teach our discipline? Who are we? What is our role as a faculty member as we're talking about our discipline and talking about the gospel? What can we do? What are the limits? Those are the kinds of, I think it raises some interesting questions. Anybody on the in the group here? Scott, you want to say anything more about it? I don't see Steve and Craig here.
Well, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is we certainly have authority to share our own personal feelings and testimonies. And, as I said in there, we sometimes have a habit of wanting to say more than we know from either perspective. But I guess I've actually been thinking a lot today about this. I think we do. I come from the sciences, and after yesterday's discussion, I looked at the Chronicle this morning, and a very interesting article there. It said the headline of the story was "The New War Between Science and Religion," and went on to talk about a new movement of, I'm sure you're all aware of the creationism and the intelligent design. And now there's a sort of a movement afoot called accommodationists. And the underlying idea is that there are things that science can answer and there are things that science can't. And so the extent that there's areas that science can't really address, maybe it's okay to have some belief in supernatural is kind of the term that they'd be using there. And this article was written by an atheist, kind of saying it's only a matter of time and science will explain everything, and so kind of let's keep these religion guys out of our hair. But I read that and I thought, here at BYU, I think we really do have almost, an obligation, not almost, but an obligation to help these students recognize that the two are compatible, that secular learning and faith, and bringing those together. And I think if we don't do something that fits our personalities to help them get the message that we are comfortable with them both coexisting, then I don't think we help them as much as we can to become comfortable in their own minds as far as pursuing secular knowledge in a context of faith. So, I think we just have to be true to ourselves, but within that we can say, I think, quite a bit.
Somebody wanted to get in here, please.
I think the first thought that comes to mind is Harry Olson, who's a family science, probably many of you know him, but just teaching the principle of asking ourselves, do we sift our discipline through the gospel or the gospel through our discipline? And there's such a great difference. And the other thought I had was, I think the difference really is, do we have the right to teach the gospel or to preach the gospel? I think even in the religion department, nobody has the right to preach the gospel, because that's something that's an ecclesiastical calling. And so to me, whether it's religion, science, whatever field, we not only have the right but the responsibility to teach the gospel by the Spirit. Not even the multiplication tables we know should be taught without the Spirit, which has a lot to do with connecting with the student, but just the whole idea that you know, at least I remember my interview here at BYU when it was an appointment. Seminary teachers are never sustained in the sacrament because they are appointed, they're not called even. And so, anyway, this idea of teaching and preaching is so different. I have the right responsibility to teach the gospel in the classroom, but not to reveal some new revelation, but to expound upon what prophets have revealed, such as Harold B. Lee or President Monson.
Do those who preach the gospel have the right to announce new doctrine? What's the difference between preaching and teaching?
Well, to me, a preaching means an ecclesiastical calling, someone in that stewardship has. I mean, in other words, in an academic environment, to me, the two are quite different. Teaching and preaching implies two different things to me. Even if I'm teaching religion or another subject in which I'm introducing, I'm sifting my discipline through the gospel rather than the gospel through my discipline.
Steve and Craig are both talking about, am I called to do this? And you're putting an emphasis on that too. What's the difference between having a call to preach and to teach and teaching? And does that say something about what our role is?
Authority in your stewardship, knowing where the line is.
Yeah. Comments?
Yeah, I think that we've got two certifications. One of them is the academic study that we've engaged in, and the fact that the university has hired us and certified us as being qualified in the field that we're supposed to address. And then there's the other side of that that's informal, which is all kinds of corroboration. He who's been warned needs to warn his neighbor. We're to be our brother's keeper. Those come from very high authorities. Those people that say those things have authorized us and all others to be engaged in the pursuit of eternal life for all people. And that doesn't empower us. It doesn't authorize us to do more than that. That is just to those who've been warned, to warn their neighbor and to keep track of our brother, even though they may be students in our class. And to a certain degree, President McKay's invitation that every one of us is a missionary. If we pursue the understanding of a missionary as that which draws people toward Christ, or if you were to put it another way, to draw people toward truth as best you can find it, then I think that authority has already been given to us as human beings, quite apart from the fact that we may be appointed at the university. If we use our university appointment to usurp or to overstretch that boundary, then I think we'll be exercising righteous dominion, but we can't advocate that other side.
Interesting. Other comments about it, please?
I'm Brother Tolman. I teach mathematics. About 3 years ago, and I'd heard of other people doing this, and I thought, not in a math class. But I began starting each class with a prayer and with a scriptural or spiritual thought, which I would call upon the students to give. The change in the atmosphere in the class was incredible. I think our appointment comes when we are called to serve on campus. We then have the authorization, I feel, to teach the gospel in our coursework. I think that's all we need. And it's interesting that invariably in the student evaluations, and I get a lot of negatives, but invariably, almost to a person, the students say they appreciated most in that class the prayer and the scriptural thought and the faith and the testimony. Mm. And many of them have said that this is the first class they've ever had on this campus, other than religion, where that happens. And it changes the way I feel about the students and the way the students feel about me, and more importantly, the way they feel about each other. And interestingly, I've learned from my students about gospel and about the doctrine, because some of them are incredibly spiritual. I think we don't appreciate how good these young people are, how spiritual they are, until we hear them bear their testimony and give a spiritual thought and explain something about the gospel. It only takes maybe 3 minutes during the beginning of the class period, but it's been an incredible. I should have started it 30 years ago.
Thank you, Jeff. You wanted to.
Well, I was just going to say, authority is a bit of a loaded word, I think, and I think you have to follow the Spirit in all things. But authority also, I think, is what's your authority as a friend. So if you have, as a friend, you see somebody doing something they shouldn't do, or you feel like you need to say something. A good friend knows when to speak up, and a good friend also knows when to shut up. I think a faculty member can be the same way. Sometimes it's best not to introduce something that, it's inappropriate. And then other times, I think it's important to stand up and say or do something that will help them. So.
Thank you. Go ahead, give it to Scott. Yeah.
I guess the other thought that I had listening to the conversation is, I think we have to be true to our disciplines, and sometimes bringing in a real gospel-oriented discussion may or may not be appropriate for the subject that we're discussing at the particular time. But to the extent it is, I think it's important that we remember that every one of us is here with the consent of the board, which means we met with the general authority who basically said, you belong at BYU. And that actually gets renewed every year through an ecclesiastical endorsement. So in some sense, we do have ecclesiastical leaders saying, you have a responsibility at BYU. And I think in terms of the callings typically, they're associated with ecclesiastical units, a ward, a stake, a mission, whatever. And so you get assignments like BYU, I don't know where exactly you would sustain us if we had a calling, because we're really not tied to an ecclesiastical unit. But I think we have been given a mandate to try to build these students in the gospel.
These are interesting and difficult questions, I think, at some point. Not too difficult at the point of what the board expects of us. That's why I took names in for, 8.5, 10 years to the board of many of you. And you needed an ecclesiastical endorsement and also a scholarly endorsement. And they looked at that, both of them, very carefully. And they believe you are role models. And that people should not, Ross was talking this morning about, what do I do in physics? Well, you shouldn't hide. They should know where you stand on important things. President Campbell gave a talk here and said precisely that. When it comes to bearing testimony and do I have a calling about that, at some point if I'm an ordained minister, if I'm a missionary, if I'm the bishop and I bear testimony, and I have access to ordinances for those people, that's something different. I'm evaluating them with respect to that testimony. But if I'm in class and trying to say who I am and at least what I'm trying to do, I think there's an expectation, not that we all bear our testimony in a formal kind of way necessarily, but that they know who we are, where we stand. But I'd then go back to what Scott says on tape here, which is let's not overclaim either. Let's be careful that we're not claiming things we don't know in our science, that is going beyond that and avoid being or move beyond being careful scholars. And let's be careful about what kind of truth we're announcing from a gospel point of view as well, and how much we think we're imposing that on the students. I taught a class where I'd just gotten back from being a mission president. I bore testimony and talked about what I did when I was a mission president. And some of my students just loved that, and we got into some things, philosophical things about leadership and self-deception and some other sorts of things. Some of my students loved that, and some of my students just hated that because it felt like I was imposing on them that this is about testimony, and you have to accept that if you're going to be a good member of the church. I had no idea that they were, but I needed to make that an open conversation. I needed to be clear, that's something we can talk about. You can disagree about the philosophy. You can disagree about my testimony, too. That's okay. I'm not imposing this on you. I'm saying where I am and where I stand. I think there are some important issues here that we ought to tease out and be sensitive to. And I want to move to a couple of other issues, if that's all right. But my sense is, Stephen, do you have one? Please.
I think one of the great opportunities we have, it may feel forced if we were to bring in a prayer and a spiritual thought that's from any gospel topic, kindness or the atonement or the plan of salvation. But we have a wonderful opportunity that fits squarely with all of our agendas as teachers, which is to talk about learning in the light of the gospel. And so I often like to share quotes from the Ames or from devotionals that talk about, one of my favorite quotes is President Hinckley saying, mediocrity will never do. Give it your very best. You're here at BYU. This is your only chance. Go for it. That's the sort of 50% of the right words in it. But it's an amazing, inspiring, motivating quote given by a prophet that really applies to attitudes and hearts in my classroom right now. And it doesn't impose upon them, it invites them.
Really good stuff.
One last item. I meant to mention, I can't tell you how many times during this spiritual thought that I've had students come to me and tell me, thank you, I needed that today. I was having problems, and it's interesting, I felt the Spirit there. And I'm not sure what kind of subjects you can relate in the gospel to mathematics. And often it didn't relate to mathematics. But I felt the Spirit, and those students were benefited. They had needs that were not met until we had done that.
Thank you, Brother Tommy. You want to just give that to Jeff, and we'll now move to some alternative ways of bringing the gospel in. I want you to hear some of the differences among these faculties. They're talking about, should you use gospel language? How explicitly? In what context? Some important questions here.
One of our earlier accreditation events, we were supposed to have, like mission statements and conceptual framework, and we had like the gospel of Jesus Christ appear in different places, and our faculty felt like that was inappropriate, that we should find words that would relate better to a broader audience and stuff. So, but certainly our students all the time will say, well, I'm not sure I believe in this, and I think this might be better. And but for the most part, just mostly so that we have a framework that we can take through our.
Because I was thinking, it's one thing, of course, to say good lad's approach is a given, and we'll find things in Scripture that illustrate this, or expand on it. It's quite another to use the gospel of Jesus Christ as a critiquing frame, a framework for critiquing good lad's approach, because I think that could be done rather successfully. But you do that.
Well, I don't know if we use the gospel, but we just don't pretend like good lads is the be all and end all, because the students, especially our students, and I'm sure yours too, when they serve missions, and they'll say, well, what about, and so they certainly extend them. It's been very helpful for us.
See, I think the connection I'm making is that I use probably more Christian scriptures and so forth to critique the social sciences and some level, psychology in particular. Are you using it to critique the code of ethics? Or are you using it as a way to say, well, it's compatible with what we do? What's your stance as you're doing it?
I think we take a look at it from many different angles, and I like to have the students feel that they have my respect in being able to look at it from different ways and express maybe some of the tension and conflict they feel as they're doing that. And I feel like that journey in itself is really quite valuable, because to be forced to do, not forced, but to have the opportunity to do that, I think is very helpful, because we're not going to be here in Utah Valley forever. They're going to go in every part of the world, and they're going to be
conversant in not only what they believe, but how that relates to the beliefs of others.
Jini is in social, Jini Roby, the last one who commented, is in social work. And she's talking, we didn't have time to put the rest of this in, but she's talking about helping her students deal with how will I counsel with gay and lesbian clients? How will I deal with my stance, and how will I talk about that to those who are gay and lesbian, and whether they want to have, and how will I deal with the code of ethics in social work, the field, and when that code doesn't agree with what I, and so what I feel, and the tensions, those are some of the tensions she's talking about. Marie is saying, we don't feel comfortable about using gospel language when we're out in the school districts. And she's actively talking about, so democracy and other kinds of language, good lad's approach has a number of values that would be compatible, more or less, with the gospel. And Brent's life is saying, I'm in clinical psychology, and he's taking the point of view of, I think we should use the gospel and explicit gospel language to critique the assumptions of the discipline. Can you see not just three, but multiple ways of thinking about when would you use gospel language, when wouldn't you, with what audiences, how do you talk about this? Any comments that Marie, others would, yeah, do you want to, yeah, we've got some mics around. Go ahead.
Well, one thing I learned from going through a number of accreditations, we actually hired an accreditation coach to critique some of our work, and he really encouraged us and supported us in changing our language in the places where we had the gospel of Jesus Christ. He felt like, not that he knew we were a faith-based institution, but it was kind of the notion of casting our pearls before swine. And he said, if you can find language that does appeal to a broader audience, that means some of the same thing, then it allows your students to talk about it in a framework outside of the university. And so just one simple example, like with the Good Lad thing that's been mentioned, the Good Lad moral dimensions of teaching, one of those moral dimensions is nurturing pedagogy. So if we use the term nurturing pedagogy, the students can understand that and talk to their cooperating teachers, and they can use that in the public schools with Mormon and non-Mormon, and it's widely acceptable. But if they say, you are a child of God and we want to teach like Jesus teaches, then it means very much the same thing in a lot of ways. But by using the term nurturing pedagogy, our students can actually see the connection to the public schools. And I think that's important. From reading some of the senior survey information, one of the pieces of information I found interesting was that sometimes students said that their professors didn't help them make gospel connections. And I've heard professors say, well, you know, it's really not my place. The students have to make the connections. But I'm telling you, if we think it's tough to make the connections as college professors, I think it's very difficult for students to know legally and ethically what kind of language they can use in the profession unless we help them by finding compatible terms.
Other comments from any of you? How about the rest of you? Comments about what this looks like, feels like in your fields? What kinds of things you would say as advice about when you do use gospel language? In what context are we going to try to help our students learn other language so they can be bilingual or multilingual? Is this an issue for you? Not in engineering?
This is a topic where I just have fun. And upon lecturing, we're all multitasking. We're doing several things at once mentally while we teach. And if there's a phrase that comes to mind from the gospel, from our doctrine, or from our culture, then I'll just work it in. And the more naturally it sounds, the more the students pick up on it, they enjoy it.
Give us an example, can you, Rollin, if you can?
Sure. I'll talk about the law of buoyancy. And I'll have everybody repeat the law of buoyancy, which is that buoyant force is equal to the weight of the displaced fluid. And I have them repeat that as a chorus, as a choir, so to speak. And then I accuse them of not having the glazed over look of laurels after they've been saying the young women's theme for 5 years, you know. And they get a kick out of that. But they remember it, you know, it's pretty natural.
Yeah.
Before the semester, as the semester begins, I interview each student, though, and they typically reveal to me if they're a member of the church or not. If they're not, I ask them if it would be all right if occasionally I make a gospel reference. Don't want to offend them, but, and I've always received their permission. That seems to work well.
Other comments about language? How to bring the gospel in, limits. Well, I hope that's it's an important conversation. I think there are pros and cons here. That is, I think there are appropriate moments when we need to use gospel language. And the notion from President Packer about being in context or out of context, I think that I shared earlier, there's sometimes when you're talking about prayer and you're talking about faith and you're talking about our beliefs about the materiality of God, we wouldn't just say materiality. We would talk about Joseph Smith saw him, and he was resurrected, and we would talk in language that would be appropriate to our faith and be in context. But there are appropriate moments to understand we're not always in that context. We have some non-LDS students in our class. We are out in the schools. We are dealing with social work and clients who are not of our faith. We are going into the public square and need to be able to handle ourselves. Are we helping our students do both is the point. Make the connections, as Marie was saying, and be in an external context where they don't share that language. Those are important questions. It's not just integrating the gospel and using gospel language. It's doing all of those kinds of things. Yeah.
I thought I have about this was I think sometimes we use gospel words and they're kind of glossed over. We think everybody knows what I mean by this word.
Good point.
When really we probably ought to dig a little deeper into it and not just use the word because everybody's heard that word or we think everyone has. I was wondering from Brent's comment I would like an example of how he would use explicit scriptural references to critique the assumptions of his field. Because I want to know what that means. I could imagine some, but I would want to know what that means rather than just hearing that as an idea and then letting it go and thinking, oh yeah, I can go do that.
Sam, you want to rise to that challenge?
Sure. I have a pretty loud voice.
Okay.
So agency is an important principle, right? There's lots of scriptures on that. So one of the things he spends a lot of time on is talking about what are the major philosophical assumptions of most of psychology and what of them naturalism or all the isms, determinism, that make it so we take things for like hard sciences and see if they work when we study people. So we're caused by our means and all these other things. So he says, well, if we believe in agency, what does that mean when we look at these theories? How do we take them? Do they still work in explaining how people behave if we actually believe in agency? So that's kind of an example of what he does a lot of. But when I was thinking about, I never even thought of the authority thing until I watched that clip. The only time I've ever thought of the authority thing is when I'm teaching Sunday school. And it's because I'm thinking, I'm supposed to be teaching you guys the gospel, and everybody in this class knows as much or more about it than I do.
Yeah.
Whereas when I'm at school, I've at least studied the topic more than that. So the only time I see it is in the other context. In this context, I feel like I don't really teach the gospel, but maybe it's because I do it more like what he does. I just say, okay, we all agree on, we at least believe in agency, hopefully. So what if we believe in agency, what does that mean for this theory? And so we just kind of use it as a tool, more than that I'm like teaching a new principle or something.
You remind me about something around authority. Let's see, I'll see where Stephanie wants to go
What
here
I want to
first.
say about authority when it isn't teaching, it's something I wrote in my notes yesterday, is that I think one of the things that is really important that we can talk about is issues like trustworthiness, validity, credibility, and that each one of us within our fields and within our scholarship have an authority by which you speak to that discipline. And that I think that from our perspective of LDS, as an LDS person, that we have different understandings of authority than maybe our colleagues do. And that sometimes that double voiceness in our scholarship has to do with speaking with the authority that our field demands and simultaneously speaking with the authority that we, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints, demand ourselves. And so they didn't talk about authority as an issue yesterday at all. And I actually think it's a pretty big issue.
The students actually, we surveyed the students, and this was one of the questions around authority that I didn't mention earlier, but now that you're bringing it up again, the students want us to take more authority. We asked them, faculty, a statement, faculty members should not presume to have special authority or expertise in the gospel if they were to bring it into the class. The students want us to stand up. They want us to. They don't want us to worry about that. They want us to weigh in, and that's the good news and the bad news, I think. Pretty strong agreement. There were a few who picked up on this issue of authority, but most of them say, no, you're supposed to know the discipline. I want to get it straight from him. I want to know truth from you about the discipline and truth about the gospel. Whoa, I think there's a bit of a trap that we can fall into there, where they're quite willing to accept us as authorities, and we might be more authoritative than we really ought to be. So, I mean, I think that's part. Isn't it wonderful that they're open to that influence, but sometimes it can be unrighteous dominion and unrighteous authority in that sense.
I was just going to say, just one of the topics yesterday is that as Christian scholars, we have the obligation, not just the authority, but maybe the obligation to at least share our witness. And I understand the nuance that there are things, as Scott mentioned, that we don't have the right to testify over. But I was really touched by what Steve Turley said this morning, that there was a young woman in his class who really had a question about carbon dating, and he was able to help enlighten her and help her know what his views were. And he worried about what the situation might have been had she gone to another university where maybe someone not of faith would have explained his view that wasn't Christian, and maybe if her testimony wasn't where it should have been, maybe she would have dropped out. And I mentioned the experience that I had, where I had essentially the same experience with evolution. I was really questioning what the church view was, and I didn't see how the two were compatible. And then I had a professor who helped me view that. And a couple years later, I came to him and told him how much that experience meant to me. He said, "You know, it's ironic you should mention that, because I just found out that one of my former students is now inactive in the church, and I didn't have that discussion with him." And I guess what I'm trying to say is that we have the obligation to share our testimony of our views, and the authority, I think, about the things that we know, the things that we can know. And I think that if we withhold that, it's just the same thing as if we went out into the mission field and withheld our testimony. I mean, these are our investigators. These people, these students really need to hear what our voice is, especially outside of the religious domain.
Hang on to that. You want to?
My name is Chris John Draper. I teach in the Recreation Management Department. And there are two ideas that I had. One is that religion and truth are two different things. One is the philosophies of men mingled with Scripture, and the other is Jesus Christ and his gospel. And I think that we have the right to share that testimony. The other thing that occurred to me was that when Brigham Young said that we should teach with the Spirit, that teaching everything with the Spirit sort of makes it incumbent on us to have the Spirit with us. And so our preparation for class should include our own personal righteousness, readiness to listen to the Spirit. And if we have the Spirit, he will guide us what to say or what not to say. If we need to branch into more gospel-oriented language at a certain time, I think we can have that kind of direction in our callings as teachers.
Thank you. Michelle?
When I was invited to come to BYU and I was kind of lured here to join the faculty, I felt like an imposter, and I hope I can articulate some of what I've been thinking about it while you've been talking. I still at times do. I was never a student here at BYU, so this has been a whole new journey for me to incorporate the gospel. And so when Dr. Wilkins and Jane Birch invited me to be a part of this discussion last year, I had kind of grown into this experience of blending the gospel into my teaching, and I've loved that. Let me share something that happened when I was interviewed by the general authority. It was Ben Banks, and he actually asked me to bear my testimony to him. That was a little daunting to me. I thought, no, you can bear yours to me. I hope you can appreciate that, why that was daunting. But I've come to really value the importance of sharing the beauty of the gospel as the Spirit guides me. And if there's one thing that I still go back to, is I'm only an imposter if I don't let the Spirit be what guides me. The other thing I've really learned that I'm not always the expert. My students have so much to impart to me. And just last night, I didn't know if I'd have an opportunity to share this today, but it's been on my mind ever since last night. I took the opportunity to go to the temple, and when I walked into the locker room, there were two of my graduate students who I serve on their committees standing there, and that is not the first time that's happened to me, nor do I expect it to be the last. I've had them be ordinance workers when I've done initiatory, et cetera, and it always puts me on equal playing field with them. I mean, we're in the same clothes, we're in this beautiful house of the Lord, and I just think there's so much to be gleaned from their testimony. So even though I have that opportunity to share, they have so much that they share with me, and my testimony has grown so much with them. So I don't know if any of that makes sense, but I think I feel less like an imposter now, not just because of what I bring to the table, but so much of what they bring to the table for me.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's talk about the role of prayer for just a minute, shall we? Is there one another? Oh, Jim? I've got a microphone, or somebody does. There you go.
Thanks. There's nothing that's been said that I don't agree with. I very strongly agree with. But I do have one caveat. And I think there is reason to believe that a lot of our students leave BYU not knowing how to distinguish the appropriate contexts for when to talk about things and how to talk about things. I think we have a really we have a real strong obligation to help them to understand what kind of language to use in which kinds of contexts, because when we don't do that, they often find themselves in difficulty.
For example, not just the language, but am I preaching to other people? Am I the missionary, or are we having a dialogue?
Is this a job interview, or am I preaching? Is this a community meeting?
Yeah.
You know, there are a lot of places where they need to be really aware of how they will be heard, or they will actually damage the church and the church's mission.
Yeah, thank you. Let's talk about prayer for just a minute. I think there were some interesting differences. Of course, there is no policy about praying. Was there another, Dave?
Just on the question of authority, there's a couple of issues here. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's really one of the important things about academics is in some ways the authority grows out of the ideas themselves. There isn't, a pulp of physics or any other discipline and so forth. And the way you get authority is by mastering ideas, by being able to defend them and understand them and so forth. And I think, though we have degrees and we can say, oh, I've got a PhD, and we don't. If you ever get in a situation where you have to say something like that, you've already lost, right? But the real difference is that if you really deserve a PhD, you can understand the issues, explain them, defend them, or criticize them as you need to, and so forth. And I'm thinking in a way, it's almost like that in the gospel, too. On the one hand, we're not the authorities. We're not judging authorities, and so forth. But I think there's something powerful about the gospel in a certain way that it's unlike, and I'm thinking unlike certain other beliefs, other Christian beliefs, some of which are very paradoxical. Their doctrines can be very paradoxical and almost purposefully so. Ours always makes sense, and you explain it. The missionary explains something. Oh yeah, I never thought about it that way. That makes sense. Well, in other words, I've learned this from my other ministers, and it never made sense, but now that you explain it that way, it makes sense to me. In a certain sense, I think, again, the gospel too, it has its own authority. If you tell it right, it will take care of itself. And so we don't really need to throw our weight around. We just need to help other people think clearly about things. If the ideas are stupid, sooner or later it'll come out that they're stupid, and then we'll get some better ideas out of it. And we don't need to pretend that they have any authority other than that they work or they don't work, and that they're defensible.
Thank you very much. Jeff?
Doesn't BNC 121 say by persuasion?
Long suffering, yeah.
I mean, these are the attributes of authority if it's properly grounded, and it doesn't. None of it is chest beating or proof by intimidation. It's persuasion.
Great conversation.
Invitation.
Let me at least play this, because I think you're going to see some diversity and just would love to leave you with the question: what's the role of prayer in my life, in my classroom, if any? How do I think about that? There's no policy about this, even though Kevin thought there was as he started, perhaps. but some really thoughtful people talking about different reasons and ways that they use prayer. And I think it would be useful at least to talk about that, maybe. Oh, there we go. It's awake.
I pray every day in class. I just decided I'd do that every day, not just the beginning of the week, but every class, because I'm thinking, what happens in this class? We got to have the Spirit in here, somehow. And I know a lot of teachers kind of do it occasionally or the first week, but I think I need it, especially some of the subjects. So for something that simple, we're taught to pray, right? So the students jump up and pray. I've never had, some students have emailed me and said, please don't ask me to pray. But they're usually non-members or, also kids are excited to do it. So that's just a simple thing, Let's just pray every day. Let's just make sure whatever happens in here is going to be okay with Heavenly Father,
Yeah, I'm just the opposite. I never pray. I pray every day. It's always been awkward for me. It's always seemed artificial to me. But again, that's why, because there's several in our floor who do, so swear by it. And on the other hand, I've always felt like it was awkward.
And so there was kind of like this bending over backwards to make sure we didn't come across as this Mormon training institution or spiritual training institution. In the 13 years, therefore, that I've been in our MFT program, I don't think I've heard, and I've certainly never observed, a single instance of the faculty ever prayed or inviting prayer in class. It was just this kind of culture of, we don't do that here because we want to make sure that we're a credible, an academically credible unit. And so, if anything, spirituality has been kind of shunned in my area.
I actually haven't opened class with prayer, but I always pray before I go to class. And that's been a constant for all the years. Quite a few years ago, I was struggling with my health. And I'd had a back surgery and really wasn't doing well, but I was here teaching and my students knew it. And one of the students came up to me before lecture and said, Dr. Reeves, should I offer a prayer before class? And I said, yes. And she poured out her heart to the Lord about my health. I'm sorry for my emotions. But I think that was probably the start of when there was so much fear at that time in the classroom. I think I became more aware myself, and I felt the students, that they were all part of that.
What's the role that prayer plays in your classroom? How do you think about it? Please, Christine.
I have prayer in my classes. I started 15, 16 years ago because the students told me they wanted to have prayer in class. And I had the same experience as Brother Tolman. I really liked what it did. Brought the Spirit into the room, helped me get to know my students in a way I wouldn't have gotten to know them otherwise. And after I'd done it for a couple of years, I was walking through the parking lot to class one day. It was the first day of class. And I thought, should I do it this semester or not? I don't know, maybe I don't need to. And I got to class and I said the usual first day stuff, and I was about to go on without prayer. And it was like the Holy Ghost took me by the shoulders and shook me. And the thought came into my mind, you haven't had a prayer yet. So I said, we'll now have a prayer. And I've continued to do it ever since. And I think some students see it as just a formality and a rote thing, but I think for many, and many have commented that they appreciate it, they like it, I like it. And they often pray for me, and I find that very helpful. In fact, just recently, one student prayed for Sister Hanson and her family. You know, I'm single, and they know that. But I had a brother and his family who were struggling at that time. And I think he was prompted to know that I was concerned about them and prayed for them like that. So I think it's helpful. I think it's valuable. I don't say that everyone has to do it, but I found it very valuable in my classes.
Other comments about it? Yeah, Michael. You've got a microphone right by you. Might as well use it.
Just a quick experience. I have to admit, the first several years I was here, the thought of beginning class with prayer never entered my head. Then just a few years ago, I was teaching a class for the first time and the texts that we were studying were very, very complex. The ideas were very difficult. The language was very difficult. The contexts were very difficult. I was really struggling. I felt like I wasn't reaching the students. Despite the fact that I felt very passionately about the material that I was teaching, the students seemed very disengaged. And then I was visiting with one of my colleagues who also teaches the same class and who happens not to be a Latter-day Saint. And her husband also teaches here, and he also is not a Latter-day Saint. She said, I've got a suggestion for you. She said, I think you should begin class with prayer. And I was really humbled by that suggestion from a colleague who is not a member of the church. She said, my husband begins all of his classes with prayer, and he finds that it makes a significant difference. And so I went into class, the next class period, and was very candid with students. I said, I'm not sure things have been going very well. It doesn't seem to be a lot of enthusiasm or excitement for the topic. And I said, how would you feel if we began each class period with prayer? And the students were very enthusiastic about it, quickly volunteered to pray, and I felt that it really turned the whole semester around, that it helped create an environment in which students could grasp incredibly difficult concepts. And since then, I have always begun every class that I teach with a prayer. And for me, it's important that the first day of every class I walk in and I begin the class by praying myself. And it has, and again, I would never suggest that anyone who's uncomfortable with that needs to do that. All I can say is that for me, it has made a huge difference in the spirit in my classrooms.
We've got to wind up the conversation. Larry, make a final comment here. There's the...
Yeah, once you're going to wind up, though, nobody wants to hear another comment.
Sorry.
The experience I had that changed my view of prayer was when in our graduate seminar, where usually, once a week we meet, and it's usually internal, people that are making presentations, and we start that with a prayer, but we also have a number of outsiders that we invite in from other universities and give a presentation on their research and other things. And a few years ago, I invited a colleague from Penn State that came and spoke, and then a few years later, we invited one of her colleagues to come and speak. And this colleague got there and says, "Oh, Mary told me, brace yourself for the prayer. You're going to go in before you talk, and you're going to pray." And I was like, just such a part of the culture, And I said, "Is that a problem?" She said, "Oh no, she said it was wonderful. It was great. Something, you had to be ready for it, and because it's just so different, you'd never do that at other places." And I started to ask other visitors, and I'd warn them, and they'd say something afterwards, and they all seemed to really appreciate it. But one of the things that it did was that it made me appreciate something that I'd always taken for granted. That we have the option, whether we choose to or not, and we get to exercise that option depending on how we're prompted or how we feel, whether we do that or not. And I think that's a real great blessing that we have here. So.
Thank you. Wonderful comments. I'm remembering being in a humanities new faculty session with Michael and one of his colleagues, talking to some of their new faculty colleagues about, and they got to prayer, and your colleague said something about, like, I teach some pretty dark literature sometimes. These are difficult sorts of things. And he's a convert to the church, but he'd grown up and seen what in Salt Lake, like his wife was from Salt Lake, something like that, and that he'd seen how people from the University of Utah criticized the sort of Mormon seminary sort of thing. And he had a little concern about that because he saw his students coming into class, and sometimes he said, if I start with a prayer and a hymn, it will feel like seminary, and they won't be ready to engage in this kind of conversation. I'm trying to grasp at and appreciate why some people would feel uncomfortable. Why Glenn Christensen, for example, would say after Kevin said, I always pray, he says, I don't feel comfortable. It feels like an artifice. I think it can become rote. I think it can sometimes signal to the students maybe the wrong thing unless you talk about it, what we really need prayer to help us understand, as Michael's example was. But there are some who are saying, unless our students are ready to engage in a way of opening themselves to the truth that can be found in some other, and sometimes some dark places, sometimes some difficult places. My own practice has been to pray, and not always. Sometimes it's some of the periods and not all of the periods. But it also has seemed to be really appropriate. I think you said, Michael, that you pray at the first of class. I've found times when somebody wasn't willing to volunteer when I would pray, or when I would, and I think it changes how I feel about them, and that they see me caring and praying to Heavenly Father about them. I think it has to do with who we are, what we're teaching, and our faith, frankly. It's just wonderful for our non-LDS colleagues to remind us about faith. David, do you want to say something? And then we really better quit.
I had an interesting experience this last semester in a Book of Mormon class, which you would expect to have prayer. The students, after about 3 or 4 sessions, spoke up and said, it's great that we're starting with prayer, but we'd like to end with prayer as well. And I thought, well, okay. And they explained, we felt a good experience here, and we want to be able to take that with us out into the rest of the university. And I thought, we probably ought to engage our students in conversation about what they would prefer on this story. Since we have the option, maybe they ought to be able to participate more in selecting the option.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful conversation. To be continued, we have some more themes from the focus groups. We're hoping to unpack some more and have some more conversations like this. What I hope you'll do now is maybe take a quick 5-minute break. Those of you who can, I'd love to have you stay and help us kind of say what were the key themes from this conference, what are things that are your questions and things you would want to do with this, and what sort of ways could we support each other. I think that would help us help you better as a faculty center, and I hope help us reflect together on what we've learned. So I hope you'll stick around, those of you who can, to wrap up the conference together. Thanks very much for what you've contributed.